This video is part 1 in a series covering how to create this Rails 7 chat application that you see on your screen right now. On the left, you see an Electron version of this application, and on the right, we see just a regular Rails app. The Electron portion is going to be optional, of course. And we have a list of users that we can direct message, and we have some general chat rooms that we can chat in with all users. So in this case, I have a conversation here where Jane Doe and myself are DMing each other. So I might say, probably just to suffer with JavaScript, Jane. And I'll send that to Jane. And you can see here that we both see it appear. We can also come over to like the general chat room in our Electron app, or like development or testing, where you can just see me spamming stuff because I have a bug right now. But if I come over to general and I come over to general, you can see that we both see similar stuff. And also John Doe was talking in here earlier. But okay, this first video will just cover creating the Devise user accounts because we're using Turbo. Depending on when you watch this video, you may or may not need to just skip the Devise setup that we're about to do. You can always look at the timestamps in the chapters down below to skip that if you don't need to configure Devise anymore. After we configure Devise, we'll just set up some basic chat rooms, and then in part 2, we'll set up the rest of this functionality and maybe style it a bit better and some other stuff. And then we'll see if we need a part 3. But okay, let's go ahead and let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new Rails app. So for this, I'll just say Rails new Turbo chat. After we create our Rails app, we can then cd into the newly created app. And then from in here, we need to add Devise. We can do this by running bundle add Devise. That'll add the Devise gem. Then we can run our bundle install command, and then we can do a Rails g Devise :install command to install Devise. Once that's done, let's go ahead and open this up in our text editor. The first thing we need to do is come into app. Let me make sure this is big enough so you can see what I'm doing. We need to come into app, controllers, and we need to create a new controller. We need to call this the Turbo Devise controller.rb. And this is going to be a quick little copy paste from a link that I'm referencing. I'll have the link down in the description, and I'll also have the source code down in the description so you can just copy paste from some gists. So in this case, we're just pasting in a fix for Devise for right now to make sure it works with Turbo. I'll expand this so you can see the code if you would like to copy it. Apparently it's a big piece of code. So it's just this snippet right here inside of our Turbo Devise controller. And then we need to come into our Devise initializer. So we'll come into config, and we'll come into initializers and devise.rb. Inside of devise.rb, we need to add another snippet, which is going to be a snippet for Turbo up here outside of our config. And then inside of our config, we also need to add in some sections, which I'll just paste in right here. Actually, let me do a bit more space so you can see what I pasted in. So it's everything in this section right here. And after this, I think the last thing we'll have to do is probably configure our routes. So let's come into our routes.rb. And in here, we need to say devise scope :user do, put an end at the bottom, and then we'll say get users to devise/sessions new. Now we should have a working Devise implementation for Turbo. So let's go ahead and let's run a Rails db::migrate. Oh, we have to do a Rails g Devise user command because I don't think I've done that yet. Now let's do a Rails db::migrate command to migrate the database. Now let's do a Rails s command. Actually, let's do a Rails g controller pages with a home action to generate just a home page real quick. And now let's do a Rails s to start the server. We can come into our routes. We should have our home page. We'll just say this is going to be The root is going to be the pages controller and the home action, hopefully. And there we go. And now let's come into our views, our pages, and our home action. And in here, let's just create a quick block that just checks if we're logged in or if we're not logged in. Say if current user, else end. So if we're logged in, we need to do a button to log out because we're in Rails 7, so we can't use the link to. And then we just need to say the destroy user session path with a method : delete. That should let us log out. Now let's log in, and we'll log in by saying link to login, new user session path. And then we can do a link to, let's say sign up, new user registration path. Should be able to save all that and refresh here. And I probably made an error. So let's check out what the error is. Oh, this is probably it right here. I have an extra equal sign. There we go. Now we can click sign up. I'm going to sign up as dean@example.com. A password of password. That seems to have worked. We're getting a remove child node error here, probably from one of my extensions if I had to guess. So we're just going to ignore that and close the console for now. So we're logged in. Maybe we'll add some text later, but for now, let's just change this to say, I don't know, turbo chat. So we see our home page, and then we want a, eventually we want a link to start chatting or something. And for now, let's just leave this stubbed out. So that'll just be our link. We can even make this like fancier later if we want to, but this works for now. So when we click this link, we want to start building or start going to the chat dashboard of sorts. So for this, we need to create our rooms, create our messages, and tie them to our user model. So let's start by creating a room. So say, let me full screen this and bump up the size a little bit. Rails G model room. Give it a name of type string, and this will be used a little bit later, but we'll just give it a Boolean of is private that we'll set to false by default in a second here. So to set it to default, we just need to go into our DB folder. Let me just collapse everything real quick. Our DB folder, our migrations, and the second migration. We have our Boolean, and we'll just say default false. Something like that. And then we can do a Rails DB : migrate command to migrate the database. Now that we've done that, we should probably go into our user model. Because we have a room, we should probably have our users set up. So let's go into user.rb. And below this, we just want to say this validates, oops, no, this has a scope of all except, and then we'll pass in, oops, user. And then we'll just say where .not ID is user. And we're just going to use this when we have the, I don't have the application open anymore, but when we have the user list on the left side, this is just the thing that stops us from displaying our own name as a list of logged in users so we don't try to direct message ourselves. So it's just a little bit of a helper here that we're creating for ourselves. Of course, I don't know what I'm doing, so my formatting's all wrong and my formatter's yelling at me. But okay, we have that set up. The next thing we want to do is we want to go into our room. So our room.rb, and in here we need to add a couple things. The first thing we want to do, let's make sure that our rooms are unique. So we'll say validates uniqueness of the name. And then let's also give it a scope for public rooms. And then we'll just say where is private is false. So this will let us just work with the public rooms when we need to. Just another quick helper that we're creating here. The next thing we want to do is we'll want to go to our search and look up a Bootstrap CDN. grab this first link. We'll come down here and we'll just grab the CSS version of this, and then we can come into our views, layouts, application.html.erb, and below the JavaScript tag, we'll just paste in this link. We'll save this, and that'll just add some Bootstrap styling to our application, hopefully. We can then run a Rails S command to start our server, refresh the server, and we should hopefully see some of this styling taking effect. The last thing we can do real quick is we can just add in a Bootstrap navbar. So just search Bootstrap navbar, and we'll go to this page right here. We'll just grab the first navbar we see. We can then come into our app. We'll do a render for layouts / navbar. I'm getting a weather alert on my phone, probably because it's so cold outside. And then under layouts, we can just do _navbar.html.erb. We'll paste in our navbar. And then because we use the dark, I think we should probably scroll down here to the dark navbar somewhere. Yeah, this one. So we'll full screen this real quick. We want to change this light to a dark and this light to a dark. We'll then change this to say Turbo Chat, which is going to be our header. If I pull this over, if we come over to Turbo Chat, let's save this real quick, see if anything blew up. This looks fine. So we want Turbo Chat to redirect to just our root path, which looks good. So that's just something we can come back home if we need to. Okay, now that we're done with all of that, we can actually get started on the rooms. Let's go ahead and let's stop the server, and I'll full screen this. Let's run a Rails G controller. We'll generate a rooms controller with an index action. We can then start our server again, and I'll unfull screenify this. Let me close all these windows and close all of these. Next, I want to go into the rooms controller we just made. So we'll come into app controllers, rooms controller, and in the index action, we need to do we could do a before action where we authenticate user. User. Looks good. And then we can say in the index @rooms is going to equal the room.public rooms. And then we'll say @users equals user.all except current user. So you can see here we're using the two scopes that we created. So that should help us set this up. So if I come into start chatting, that link is still broken. So let's come into views, pages, home. Instead of this, let's just do the rooms path. Refresh. Oops. Okay, it looks like we need to come into our routes real quick. And once we're in here, let's change this get for the rooms to be resources for the rooms. And we'll save this, refresh, and hopefully now it's okay with us. So now if we click start chatting, we should go to the rooms index. We'll now need to create some partials to actually get started. So in our rooms folder, we want to create a room partial. So create a new file, _room.html.erb. In the room partial, we want to say we have a div. This div is going to be a link to the room.name with the room passed in. And then we'll just close this div, save this, refresh. And then in the user folder, so we'll create a user folder, or users folder, I guess I should say. We'll create a new file. We'll call this _user.html.erb. And we're basically just going to do the same thing. So we'll say div /div. We'll close this. And then in here, we'll do a link to the user.email with the user passed in. We can refresh that. We, of course, don't have any partials here, which is why this isn't updating. I don't know why I keep refreshing. We can then come into rooms and index.html. And instead of having this rooms index here, let's just get rid of that. Let's create a div with a class of container. In this div, we can add a H5. We'll say this is the GitHub Copilot suggesting PHP code. This is the current user.email. Cool. Now we can do our list of users. So we'll say H4, and this is just going to be users. Next, we can do our render for the user. So we'll say render at users. And then finally, we can do our render at rooms. And then we'll just, I don't know, we'll grab this, paste it in here, and we'll just change this to be rooms, something like this. So that should hopefully work. We should have our list of users and our list of rooms, but of course we don't have any rooms created, and we don't have any users that are not ourself. So we don't have a second user account made right now. So we can pop into our console, Rails C, and we'll do a room.create. We'll name the first one general. You can then do a room.create with a name of tech. And we can do a room.create with a name of test. So that gives us some rooms here. Now let's create a user. This is a bit more involved because we're using Devise. So we'll say user.create bang, and then we want to give it an email. For this, I'll name my second one john@doe.com. I'll then give it a password. I'll just make the password. And now I'll give it a password confirmation, which I'll call password. And hopefully I've done this correctly. Looks like I have. So let's exit out of the console, Rails S to start the server, and then refresh. It looks like our user path is wrong here. So to fix this, let's come into our routes. So we'll go into config again and our routes.rb. And in here, we need to change the user's path. So for this, I want to do a get user/:id to the user's controller show action as the user. If I refresh now, we should be good. So I have a link here, and in the bottom left, you can see that it says user/2. We also have our list of rooms. Of course, if I click on any of this, we'll just get an error thrown. But for now, you can sort of see the skeleton of what we're working on here. So the next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to add our turbo. I don't know if this step is necessary still, but we'll do it anyway. So we'll say Rails turbo : install to hopefully install turbo. It looks like some stuff ran, so that's good. So we'll hit Control L to clear our console. This step is optional. If you don't have Redis installed yet, you'll need to install it. It's either going to be a sudo or a yum command or whatever your Linux OS is. In this case, I'll run sudo apt install space redis-server. And of course, I already have this installed, so this will just work for me. So that's good. Now what you want to do is start the Redis server. So to start the Redis server, you have two options. You can either do redis-server space -- daemonize yes, I think, and that'll start it in the background, or you can just do redis-server and it would start it in the front. But of course here I have it set to start in the background. If it started in the front, you can just run a Control-C to kill it. If it started in the background, then you'll have to do like a psaux grep redis to find it, and then you'll have to do a kill of the process ID and all of that stuff. Right now I have it running in the background, so hopefully we'll be fine with that. And it's just so I can keep one window open here. So I'll run Rails S. Your other option is just start redis-server, move into another tab, and then in that other tab, run your Rails server. So I'll start the server up again, and we'll just see if this is working fine. It seems to be okay. Nothing's blowing up, so that's good. So our next step is in our application.js file. We need to, in our JavaScript, we need to come in here, and we need to make sure that we're importing everything properly. Now, I have two application.js's here, which is at least a little bit confusing. But this one is already importing Turbo Rails. So let me come into this one. This one is not. So I think this is fine with this setup, with it just importing here. I'm not too familiar with how this workflow works yet, but this looks like what my project has, so we should be good to go. So now we want to come back into our user model. If we come into models, user.rb, I'm just going to full screen this. The next thing we want to add after the scope is just a after create commit. And this is just so we can broadcast append to users, which is just going to broadcast a message after a user is created that adds the user to the list of users here. So basically, we're going to be updating this list as users are created, so I won't have to refresh the page to see this new user appear, which means we need some way for like the person to know this happened. And the way that this client knows that like Jane Doe just signed up is by this broadcasting to the users list. And then Redis says, hey, you just had this thing broadcasted, and it sends the thing to this client, who then says, okay, I need to add this Jane Doe user to the list of users. And it's similar for the rooms. So if we actually come into the room real quick, we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to say after create commit, I want to broadcast append to, and instead, you guessed it, we're going to append to the rooms. So you can already assume that when we create our message model later, we're going to be doing the same thing. So now if we want to, we can come into our index.html, I believe. And above the users, what we can do is we can just say turbo stream from users. And then we want to wrap our users in a div with an ID equal to users. So it's broadcasting and it's appending to users, which is, you guessed it, this div with an ID of users, which of course means we have to do something similar down here. We need to wrap our room in a div. And I'll pause for dramatic effect. This needs to be rooms. So we'll just copy paste this. And then of course we need to turbo stream to it. So we'll back this up and we want to turbo stream from rooms. And that is all of that set up. Now let's create a form here for us to create another room. To do this, we can come into our layouts, create a new file, underscore new underscore room underscore form.html.erb. And in here, we'll do a form with, our model will be at room. Of course, we're doing remote true for this, because we are doing the super fancy remote update of everything. And then we'll just give it a class of dflex, close our parentheses, do f. Let me full screen this because this is getting big. And let me bump up the size one. So next we need to do our text field. So say f.text field for the name with a class of form control and an autocomplete of off, because it doesn't make sense to autocomplete if you know, all of those things already exist largely. Also, it's kind of just annoying in this case. Now we want to do a f.submit, and we'll say disable with false, and then we can do our end, and that should be it for the new form. So now we can move this back over, and we should be good to go to our rooms controller. So I'm going to close all of this again and minimize all of this just to keep things organized. We'll come into our controllers, our rooms controller. In here, we'll just say, right above room, we'll say at room equals room.new, just to keep it organized. And then we need a create action now. So we'll say def create. And in here, we just want to actually create the room. So we'll say at room equals room.create with a name. We'll grab the params from this. Now, of course, we could also just, as you saw, but GitHub Copilot suggests, we could create a room params and we could sanitize the params, etc. But I'm I'm gonna leave that as an exercise for the viewer because we're sort of already pushing the time limit on this tutorial. We can now add this form. So we'll go render it. We'll go into our views, our index for our rooms index. And then below our list of rooms, let's just say, let's render our form. So we'll say render layouts / new room form. We'll save that. And hopefully I've done everything correctly. It looks like I have. So we have our form here where we can add a new room. So let's go ahead and let's add a fourth room. We'll call it fourth wall just because we think we're funny. And you can see here it gets added right away. Now clearing this console, we're going to be doing that using, or clearing this input, we're going to be using stimulus, but that's going to be saved for like part 2 or part 3. For now, you'll just have to live with this minor inconvenience. But what we can do, because we have this set up, let's go ahead and let's style this a bit better so our rooms don't take up the entire, well, room. So in this, what I did, I believe, is I had an ID of, let's see, ID equal to Chatroom container. And then for the classes, we're going to full screen this. The classes were a row with a bg-dark and a text-light. Inside of this, we had a div of class side panel for this. So we'll say div, with an ID equal to side_panel. And that had a class equal to call-md-4, call-sm-4. So we can grab all of this stuff right here, I believe. And let me save this. Yeah, that's what I thought. We're missing one div down here. And save that. So that gets us a wrapper around this, and it looks like nothing else here. It looks like this is all we had at this point. So let me come over to here and refresh. We now have a darker background, of course, but we don't have the rest of this row being used. So to do that real quick, we can just create a div with an ID equal to room container. And we'll give it some classes equal to call-md-8, call-sm-8, a bg-dark, text-light. And then hopefully this should fix some of this. Oh, I'm dumb. I had a comma next to my row up there. There we go. So now we have this sort of working. We'll add some more styling here, but this is sort of the layout right now. We have our left side is our panel and our right side is our chat. Of course, we can create the rooms, but we can't use these yet. So let's go ahead and let's get started on those. For this, we need to come back into our controllers. We need to come into our rooms controller, and we need to set up some more variables in here. So let me full screen this. We need to create a single room, which is going to be at single_room equals room.find params ID. Now we can save this, and we can come down to our index again. And in here, we can come down below the rest of our stuff, and we can say if at single_room is true, then we want to do some stuff. And what we want to do is just say, let's render the room name. So we'll say h4 class equals text-center, and we'll grab the at single_room.name. And we'll grab the h4 at the end here. So if we save that, we can now create our message model. So let me stop this, and we'll do let me full screen it. We'll do a Rails G model message with a user : references, a room : references, and a body : text. You can run that. We'll do a Rails DB : migrate command to migrate the database. We can now come into our model because we have to add these associations. So let's come into our user model. Come in here and we'll say this has many messages, and then we'll just copy this line because we need to go paste it in the room as well. Save that, come into here, paste in has many messages, and we'll save it in here. Let's now come into our views again, minimize some of this. We need to create a messages folder. So let's do a new folder, call this messages. And then in our layouts, instead, let's create a form, and we'll call this _new_message _form.html.erb. And here, all we want to do is we just want to give this a div with a class of form-group. That's not what I meant to do. Form group. And then let's also give it a class of msg-form. And again, this is all taken from a blog post covering how to create this chat room situation. There's just some of my styling mixed in between. So this is from the blog post itself, because I don't want to take credit for work that I haven't done. Form width. And then we'll do a model again. So we'll say model : at @room, comma, @message. Remote is true. And a class of, I actually need to scroll over here because I've lost my way in my VS Code. We need a d-flex for this. We'll do F. And that, oops, I think we actually need a parentheses here afterwards. Can't believe I caught that before I broke everything. And then in here, all we need to do is we just need to have a text field, f.text field for the body with an ID of chat-text and a class of form control and message content. Autocomplete is going to be off because you don't want people having their messages suggested. Otherwise, they will just spam you and they will do it endlessly and shamelessly. So now we'll do an f.submit. Data is, of course, going to be disable with false and a class of button space button dash primary, which is just our Bootstrap classes coming into play. So we'll save that. And now let me come over to here, run a Rails S command again to start stuff up, refresh. We'll run into an issue with not having a room with an ID. That's fine. What I'd like to do now is let's come into, if we come into our rooms controller, we need to actually move this @room out of here. That's what I broke. This is supposed to go into a show page instead. Or I guess I should say a show action. So we'll paste in our single room here. We also need to grab our rooms in our room and our users. So let's copy this as well. If we're copy pasting code, probably a good time for a helper method. But what we also need now in our show is our messages. So we'll do the same thing we did here. I'm going to break this up a bit. So we're going to have @message equals message dot new. We'll say @messages equals, and for this we want to grab the @room.messages and we want to .order this by created @, and I think I ordered it by ascending, which is important because of course we want the newest messages at the bottom. And then below all this, let's just say render our index. And let's also put this up here for our index action. What I'd like to do now is let's come into our assets, style sheets, application.css, and let's add in some styling. This is again going to be a lot of styling that I've taken from a blog post and then rehashed as well for my own purposes. So some of this is going to be new. Some of this is going to just be things that I've used. We're going to start with a body where we hide any sort of overflow. We'll do a .message-form. For this, we'll give it a width of 100%. Give it a height of 56 pixels, and we'll give it a padding of 10 pixels. We'll then style our single room. Give it a height. For this, we're going to do a calculation, which is going to be 100 viewport height minus 150 pixels, which is a weird calculation I came up with. Basically, the nav bar is about 50 pixels, the message form is about 50 pixels, and I wanted some additional padding, so I just take off 150 pixels. That way things don't overflow. Let me move this down. Let me also scroll in. The next thing we have is overflow, which I set the overflow-x to be hidden. And I set the overflow-y to be scroll. And I just do that because I want the scroll bar to be visible. I don't know what's wrong with me, but it's just what I like. Now we can create a messages for the messages ID. Give this similar situation. It's going to be hidden in scroll. It's going to be 100 VH minus 150 PX. Next, we can come down and say room container. And this is going to have a height of 100 VH and a margin dash right of 0 pixels and important. And this is just because the row has a margin, which was causing some horizontal scrolling that was really annoying. And it actually looks like I might have gone a bit overboard here. So you might be able to clean up some of the CSS. But the next thing we want to do is the side panel. And for this, we want to give it a height of 100 VH. We want to give it a margin dash right, 0 px importante. Let's do a overflow dash x of hidden and an overflow dash y of scroll and a margin dash bottom of 55 px. Save that. Next, we need to do our chat room container. So for this, we'll say chat room container. It's going to have a height of 100 VH, a margin dash right of 0 px important. And then, of course, we're just going to copy paste these because I'm getting a little bit tired of repeating this, which probably tells you that this isn't the most efficient CSS. Next, we want to do .msg-content. Width of 80% and a margin dash right of 5 px. And finally, the message box. I don't think I touched this one, so this one is once again coming from the blog post on creating the Action Cable chat app. But for this, we need to do a word wrap break word. We want a width of fit-content. A max width of 40%, a padding of 5 px, a border radius of 10 px, a margin bottom of 10 px, a background color of 555, 555, and a padding of 10 px. And then we also want to add our semicolon here. And save that. And I think that's it for the styling. Don't know if we need it. But if we now click on general, we have a general chat here, a tech chat, a test chat, and a fourth wall chat. And nothing seems to be blowing up, which means we've made some semblance of progress here. We have our messages. Let's come into our routes again. So we'll say our config and our routes.rb. Our rooms resources needs to wrap the messages. So let's do that. And in here, let's just do our resources for our messages. We'll save that, move it over, and we can refresh the page. Let's now come into our messages model. And in here, let's do a after create commit, broadcast append to, and we want to append this to the self.room. Let's now come into our index because we need to, of course, modify the index here. And let's full screen it. And down here in our single room, we need to modify this a bit. So we're checking if we're in our single room. So let's say we are. Let's do a div then with an ID equal to single room. And then we can close this div. We can then say inside of this where we have our header, we have our text center. We want to do the username or the @single_room.name. Let's do user and .email, because we don't have a username, or we'll do the single room. Let's save that. This will probably blow something up at some point as we continue along. The next thing we want to do is to actually do our turbo stream. So let's do a turbo stream from @single room. And then let's do a div with an ID of messages where we render the @messages. We'll close this. And now let's do a render for our new message form. Save all of that. Come over here and refresh. We'll run into an error. We need to come into our form real quick for our new message. And we need to actually end this. Sorry, I have the attention span of a squirrel sometimes. We'll refresh. And now we have our create message, but of course our CSS is messed up, which is no surprise there. So let's grab our form here. Let's move this up above our rooms to the top of the list. Let's come down to our rooms here, which has a div, and I think we need one more closing div here. So now if we add in this closing div, hopefully this causes things to... Okay, well for now, we're just gonna leave this alone and we'll see if this resolves itself as we move further along. So what we wanna do next is we actually need to come into our messages and create our message partial. So let's do an underscore message.html.erb file. And then inside of this message.html.erb, we'll do a div. Oops. And the div will be a unless message.room.isPrivate, which is our Boolean, which is set to false by default, so we don't have to worry about that right now. But unless that's true, we'll create an h6 with a class equal to name. And we'll say this is the message.user.email. And then we'll close our h6. And then end this, and then we'll do a message content. And we can save that. Go over here again and refresh. And nothing will change. We'll now want to create the messages from our actual application. So for this, we'll need to have a messages controller. Looks like I haven't created a messages controller yet, so we should probably make that. So say Rails G controller messages. And then in the messages controller, we need to create a create action. So say def create end. And then we need the @message to be equal to our current user, current user dot messages dot create with the body equal to the message params body. I just realized I did a typo at the other in the partial. And then we want to do a room ID with params of room ID. Then we'll come down here. We'll create a private section. We'll say private. Do a def message params where we require the message and permit the body. Now let's come back to our new message form. Oops, not our new message form. Let's come into our messages partial. And in here, let's change this to message.body. So if we refresh, if we start the app and we refresh, should now see a way of making a message. Let's full screen this. And yeah, some of the CSS is clearly broken, but let's just give this a shot. Let's say hello world, but we're not in our general room, it looks like. Let's say testing. I'll hit enter, and there is our testing appearing up here. So our CSS is clearly broken, but our functionality is here, which is, I guess, what's important right now. So let's now come into our rooms controller. And in our rooms controller, we are grabbing all the messages, so we're good there. Let's now come into our actual message partial again. And in our message partial, I need to look at my other VS Code. We want to give this div a class equal to cont dash, and then the message.user.id. Oops, like that, I believe. We then want to wrap this part right here in a div with a class equal to message-box msg-message.user.id. Get rid of one of those, put a quote there. We then, we wrap this and the message body, and then we close the div down here. So if I save that, everything in here is formatted properly. Should be good to refresh. We're now getting the styling for this, but we still have 3 scroll bars, of course. So let's see if we can't fix that. Let's come into our application.css. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the chat room container has a scroll of hidden. So let's refresh. That gets rid of one of our scrolls. Now the second one, our single room, needs to not have these scrolls. So if we save that, that should now fix things. Our nav bar is still messed up, of course, but this is looking a lot more functional. Let's come into our nav bar real quick. Okay, it looks like our nav bar isn't broken, but some of our other CSS still is. So for now, let's just continue along our path. Let's come into our application.html.erb file. And in the head here, we just want to add a bit of style. We want to do some ERB here. And then inside quotes, .msg dash current underscore user and .id. We want to do some braces. Oops. And then we just need to do background dash color is 007 BFF, important, and then a padding of 10 px. And then we want to do another one of these, which is for the CONT, and then it's for the current user ID. Say display is going to be flex, and justify content is going to be flex end. And that should be good for that. So let's save that, come over here, refresh. Has this resolved our issues yet? Let's see. No. So let's just keep going. It's a work in progress. Let's now open up a new tab. I'll open up a Cognito tab. I'll come here and I'll just create a second account, sign up. I'll say jane@doe.com, jane@doe, password of password. Start chatting, say dean@example.com. Oops, we can't do that one, but we can come into general. And we'll say hello. That seems to be working, but of course, this still isn't styling it correctly. Okay, so I think I've isolated it, and it seems to be an issue with our Bootstrap CDN. And it looks like it's a Bootstrap 5 issue, so I'm going to go grab Bootstrap 4. What we're going to do is we're going to come over and we're going to search for Bootstrap 4 stack path CDN. Hopefully this gets us a better solution here. We'll grab this one instead, come into our application.html.erb file. We'll paste this one in, save it, come back to our application, refresh, and now we have a nav bar that looks better. If I click on general, that at least fixes that issue. So now we just have to deal with these messages being a little bit messed up. And to do that, I'm going to inspect real quick, and I'm leaving this in because I think it's educational to see how you fix stuff like this. So they both have the same classes. So let's come into our message partial because that has to be where this is happening. If it's actually this, I'm going to be a little bit upset with myself because I missed a semicolon. And I'm going to feel like the juniorist of developers right now. So it seems to have fixed one of these, but not both because now they're both being pulled to one side. Okay, this might actually be the worst bug I've ever run into because I don't know what's wrong with it. And I have checked. It is not the spacing. For some reason, this fixes the issue. If I save this, and I refresh, it pulls it over to the left. I don't know why. Because if I save this, and I unindent these, it's still broken. So for some reason, this is fixing it. Actually, that's not fixing it. I don't know what's wrong here. But if I copy this one, oops, and I paste it in, that fixes it. So for some reason, this is fixed when these spaces are used. But okay, so we now have this working after a lot of really, really awful user experience bugs for me as a developer. So we can now move on from this section. Unfortunately, we're now out of time because this video is already about an hour and a half long. So in part 2, we'll cover creating the private chats, the Electron apps, and polishing this a bit more, as well as fixing the stimulus stuff so that when you hit create message, it deletes this. And then when you add another one, it'll scroll you down after you send the message.